Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the welcome back here. Now my second time in Aberdeen. I was thinking as I was driving in yesterday and walking around then back from the car park last night, how different Aberdeen looks from when I was here in late spring on account of the snow. It's not to say it was exactly tropical when I was here the first time, but the snow really brings something out. And I think particularly in a beautiful city like Aberdeen, with all the wonderful architecture, especially the Gothic, the Neo-Gothic, with all the moldings and carvings and so on, a little layer of snow just brings something out that sometimes goes unnoticed. And as I thought about that, waking up this morning, then I realized, this is actually, in some ways, a good image for what we're trying to do, in large part with classical Christian education, which is to say, encounter the world again, the familiar, but through a somewhat different lens that brings out something radiant and true about it. Before I begin to talk a little bit about the work of Memoria Press, I was thinking about the words of Psalm 90, where the psalmist says, "So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." And of course, in a sort of best case scenario, we may have those 80 years, but we don't know. And in a sense, we live every day under the aspect of eternity, and this thought that this day may be our last. And so we're called to use our time wisely. One thing that we can number with some reliability is how many hours are spent in school. And some of the speakers yesterday addressed this as well. But just to put a little bit of color to the question, it's in most countries in the Western world, it's more than 30 hours a week. That comes to something like 120 hours a month. And again, in most countries, that'll amount to more than 700 hours a year. And repeat that for 13 years. That's quite a lot of time. And one would, of course, hope that that time is well spent. At Memoria, we think the best way to spend those hours, those months, those years is with classical education. We had a really nice definition yesterday from Jenny Boot, so thank you for that. And I think what I'll say now is basically a recapitulation of that. But we see classical education as a formation in wisdom and virtue through the scriptures, through the Latin and Greek classics, those languages where possible, through those civilizations that formed, along with the Judeo-Christian civilization, formed the West that we inhabit, and through it also significant parts of the rest of the world, through the liberal arts, through the study of nature, and through great books. And this is not just about knowledge, this is not just about knowing, but this is about conditioning our habits, so that we are inclined, through our virtues, to follow the good, to love the true and the good and the beautiful. So that encapsulates, I suppose, the vision that we have for how those many, many hours ought to be spent. But of course, that didn't come out of nowhere. And of course, those hours in most schools today are not spent in pursuit of that kind of end. So I want to tell you a little bit about where Memoria comes from as really by now a family of operations in the sense of a group. It started as an actual family, the Lowe family in Louisville, Kentucky. Some of you may have encountered them in person or in various publications. And this started with a mother and father who were sending their boys to schools that were reputed to be strong, academically and otherwise, and they were very disappointed with what they were seeing. So in those dark days of the early 1990s, before Google and so on, what did Mrs. Lowe do but go to a library and started to read about the history of education under the thought that, well, it can't always have been so bad. And she steeped herself in as much of the history of education as she could, and then started teaching her boys a little bit after school and said, I could do this better myself. I pulled them from school. The neighbors found out, started sending their children. They lined up some desks in a room in their home and opened effectively the first homeschool cooperative in the area. And with time, interest was such that they felt they were being called to open a school as well, which because of the area of Louisville that they were in, which is the Highlands district, it's called Highlands Latin School. So there's an indirect connection, I suppose, to this fair land of Scotland, rather than a direct one. But they do lean into it. They have pipers now. That's fast forwarding a bit. They didn't have pipers right at the start. But then it turned out that people in other towns nearby and further afield in other states were interested in just what they were teaching there. And so the press was born. And those two things, really, the homeschool cooperative and then the formal school, both of which continued to exist side by side, along with the press, those grew up all together. And so that meant that anything that was then sent out to homeschooling parents or schools elsewhere had first been taught in a classroom, either in the Highlands Latin School or in the homeschooling cooperative, which we call the cottage school. So fast forward some 20, 25 years after that had gotten going, Highlands Latin School in Louisville now has about 800 students. There are two campuses that feed into each other for the upper years, along with that cottage school, which has several hundred others. We have a network of Highlands Latin schools around the U.S. with some 20 members. There's a further accreditation association to support new schools that are launching in various stages, with several hundred members. We are screen averse in general, and we can maybe talk a little bit more about the role of technology in the Q&A if there's interest in that. But we also recognize that there are families who live in areas with very few opportunities for good schooling and few other families with whom they could pool resources to start something. And for them, teaching online can be a real godsend. And so we're fully happy to support them with that. And there are several thousand pupils around the world who use Memoria Academy, which is which operates as a completely separate school with its own principal and so on. This is partly to do with some family members of the Lows who have intellectual disabilities, and partly from family members or let's say friends of the Memoria world who are in similar positions, who love the classical idea and thought, wouldn't it be great if we could do something like this for those children who may be delayed or even suffer from more serious impairments. And so together with a woman named Cheryl Swope, who had a daughter in that kind of situation, we offer what's called Simply Classical, which is a version of our whole curriculum for the whole range of ages, precisely to cater to those who otherwise would be excluded from this. And just to give an idea of the contrast, when the sister of one of the owners was growing up in the 1970s, 80s, provisions for people with, say, Down syndrome were really very, very limited. And so instruction might be something like, okay, make sure you tie the shoes correctly. Can you purchase a bus ticket and find your way home? Do you know your address? That sort of thing. But the world of the arts or poetry, that sort of thing, was not on the radar for those. So it's important for us to try to, although we have very high academic goals, also try to bring along everyone as much as possible. So that's roughly, and the last thing that I'll mention is Memoria College. So this is also done online. It's a full master's program, as well as there's a teacher training option through the Classical Latin School Association, which is the accreditation program. And the idea is we know that there are loads of parents and teachers out there who want to go deeper into this whole classical Christian thing, but they can't just drop their jobs. They can't just leave their family homes and take a year or two to do a full master's program somewhere. So it's a remote program, but it is done live. So you have the same experience of a seminar type format. It's not just recorded lectures. So I teach a bit for that, but I also work for Memoria insofar as director of UK and European operations. I will come back a bit to some of those operations at the end. I want to say a little bit more about the ethos of the curriculum and the content, as well as the pedagogy. that's involved. So again, this is a concise statement of what we're aiming for with a classical education. It's a formation in wisdom and virtue through the scriptures, through Latin and Greek, the civilizations of Greece and Rome, and all that came from them, through the liberal arts, through the great books, and also through some of the good books, which may not necessarily rise to the level of great books, but are nonetheless formative and important, especially at an early age. That's what we understand classical education to be. In our school mission, we always begin with the phrase, in partnership with parents. And I was very happy to hear some remarks to this effect yesterday. Although we've become something quite large, and we have a number of different operations now, the idea is absolutely never to usurp the role that parents have first and foremost in the education of their children. That's a God-given right and privilege and obligation. And so when parents send their children to a school or homeschooling cooperative, it's understood that that is a delegation of the authority to teach, but it is absolutely not an abrogation of it, and it's not a divestment of it. And so we strive at every step of the way to work with families and parents. And I would say probably, I'm not sure quite how many, but a good number of my colleagues themselves have been involved in launching homeschooling operations, or in terms of cooperatives, or just homeschooling their own families, or setting up schools. And so we know from direct experience in their cases, in my case, having the privilege to meet groups like Doxa Theo and many others around the United Kingdom and Europe now, we know how much you value the education of your children. We know how important that is for your families, and we know how much it takes as well. Many of you are working full-time jobs, and on top of that, at the end of the day, you're thinking, how can I lay the institutional groundwork for something that will last for my family, for my church's families, for others in the area. And so that's something that we always very much want to honor, and we want to supply materials that will make that as easy as possible. That means that we try to support in our published materials lesson plans that a teacher who may not be an expert in English literature, for instance, could follow, so as to draw out some important questions that may appear in books that are part of the curriculum. That also means that we're very dedicated to picking up the phone, answering an email if you have a question. We have a really great team back in the US. Again, many of them have been teachers or homeschooling parents themselves, and they know the curriculum very well. So that's the way to say we're there for you. So when we say in partnership with parents for school statements, that we take that very, very, very seriously. I want to say something about the teleology of the program, the end orientation. What's the telos? What's the goal? We work backwards in a sense. When the curriculum was being developed, the question was, what's the kind of person that I want my son, my daughter to be when he or she turns 18, when they finish this program? What do we want them to be able to do? Of course, there's a lot of talk also in state schools about competencies and so on. Whether they deliver on those sorts of promises is quite another matter. But also, what kind of person do we want this young person to be? And so, for instance, to take biblical literacy for one, if we want someone to know the arc of salvation history and the content of the scriptures when they go out into the world, that's going to mean teaching in a certain way already from earliest youth. And so running through the scriptures, cycling back at an ever deeper level is an important part of the Christian studies curriculum, memorizing verses. If we want them to be the sort of person who understands the breadth and depth of the human experience, literature, also secular literature, is a very important part of that. The stories that explore the heights and sometimes the depths of the human experience. And that will mean not just throwing books in front of somebody, but also being able to take them through the narrative structure to look for the meaning of symbolism and to have a sense of the way virtues and vices play into the structure of the stories and the consequences of characters' actions. C.S. Lewis has this line about reading great literature being an occasion for seeing as if with 1,000 eyes. And I believe he says something almost so strong as becoming so many characters. And that's not just a sort of flight of fancy and an escape from reality. It's a way of acknowledging that we can't, and even if we could, we shouldn't want to experience everything that's possible for humans. But literature is a record of things that people have experienced or might experience and writ on a grand scale. And so this is a way of coming to know human reality. If we take the natural world, there's apparently a shortage these days, I'm told, of in even academic botany, of people who are able to identify plants. And I certainly, I had a little bit of that, and I didn't get it at school. I got it through the Boy Scouts. But still, a forest is far too mute when I'm walking through it, and I'm ashamed of that. I didn't have the kind of education, and it needn't come through school, although it could very well. But I didn't have the kind of education where I'm able to have that kind of academic experience of going out and naming things, or at least recognizing the names of things that have been given by those who came before me. In other societies, and in maybe a saner moment of ours, again, this kind of thing needn't come through a school, but at this point, it's a great way of recovering a sense of what is out there, namely by including nature studies, not in the way that would immediately start with dissecting things and pulling them apart and reducing them to their smallest constituent elements, but by appreciating them as wholes. That's an oak, that's a maple, that's a fir. That encounter with the beauty of the created reality is a rich and vivid part of too few educations these days. So we want to support that. If we want young men and women to have some sense of where the human world came from in terms of societies, laws, histories, these sorts of things, we may want them to read Caesar. And if we want them to read Caesar, then they should start with Latin relatively early. If we want them to read the New Testament in Greek, then they should have some Koine, wherever possible. If we want them to be able to write, and so on and so on. So we start from this end that we have in mind and work our way back. I've given a smattering of the kinds of content that may show up in a classical education. I'll just close with thoughts on the curricular portion of what I mean to say, by saying that, again, this is not just about competencies, but it's about the kind of character as well. And so, again, one can read a great book and get a sense of the narrative structure and know what happens, but cultivating the affective habits to be able to sympathize with the good characters and feel pain at the right moments and feel joy at the right moments is something else entirely. And in few state-promoted literature programs, I think, does that come through in the clear way, with a clear language of virtue and vice and right and wrong and good and evil that would come through in a classical education. And what allows for this is really the whole vision of the human person that classical Christian education affords. I want to say something about pedagogy, rather briefly. First of all would be the sense of wonder. We want there to be a sense of awe, and that this wouldn't evaporate through schooling. Schooling is not just a matter of learning lists. I'll come back to those lists because we're not opposed to lists. But there should always be this freshness of an encounter with the sort of tang of being, and that's a taste of the goodness of creation as it's meant to be. But again, we're not opposed to lists. When we come down from that extraordinary sense of awe and wonder, look how beautiful Aberdeen is under a blanket of snow, there's a place for the mundane, day-to-day work of learning, and that's going to involve memorization, recitation, repetition, mastery, of the sort that we see on any football pitch or in any school of music. These things are blindingly obvious to most people, including in the secular world, that you just have to practice and repeat and take the same shot over and over and over again before you're really proficient, or play that scale, or repeat those steps of a ballet. And only through that do you achieve mastery. So why would it be different in the setting when we're trying to learn the scriptures, when we're trying to learn history? It's not a bad thing. I did this with an experiment with some adult students recently. I said, okay, you've heard it said that flashcards, memorization is this cruel, oppressive method. And over the course of the lectures, I added dates of Roman history each time. And at the end, they knew more or less the broad outline of Roman history. And I said, was that so painful? Was that so terrible? No, they all had smiles on their faces, and now I know something. So of course, one can teach in a stifling and dry and deadening way, but we just think that that's a caricature. It needn't be that way. Teacher-led instruction, we're not child-centered in a way. We have a view of the whole person, and we want to educate from child to young woman, but it's not so totally focused on the child. The teacher is not there to be the buddy or and what you'll hear in state school education settings often is you don't want to be a sage on the stage, you have to be the guide on the side. Of course it rhymes, so it's catchy, but we think this is silly. The teacher's there because the teacher's meant to teach, and we're not ashamed of that. An easy one for the UK is uniforms. It's a little bit unusual in the US, but uniforms just keep the focus off of fashion and on the matter at hand. Same thing with the walls. A very simple decor. This may seem trivial. A few classical paintings or prints, for instance, but keep the focus on the lesson. Maybe a geography map, something like this. You'll enter classrooms where the walls are just exploding with arts and crafts projects. And that's chaos. Maybe I'm easily distracted, but I just get nervous in a setting like this, and I think many people are that way. I'll just close now by saying that the position that I have at Memoria is relatively new and was created in response to what we saw to be growing interest from the UK, from the EU, and it's a sign of our commitment to working with you to bring materials here. We now have warehouse space in the UK, which cuts what I understand to have been exorbitant shipping. Hope that makes it much easier for you here. We're also always interested in hearing feedback. We're aware that, as Churchill said, Americans and Brits are two peoples divided by a common language. There are differences here. We are working on adapting certain elements of the curriculum. We're having a former science editor at Oxford University Press looking at the nature studies program. She comes from a bird watching family, which is great. We are very lucky to have a Christian teacher down at Eton who's been reviewing some of the early years storybooks material. And there's maybe only so many storybooks about George Washington and the 4th of July that will be of interest on this side. So also very happy to come always and visit schools like Dr. Theo and others. As I say, it's a real honor, and we know how much you're investing in this. And if we can judge from experience in the US over the last 20, 30 years, we feel very, very sure and very hopeful that it will pay off. So we wish you every good thing. I'm very happy to talk to you. There's a little display I've seen in the back. Do take a magazine and any of these little brochures. Feel free to walk home with. But thank you very, very much for the hospitality. Appreciate it.